This is We the Sales Engineers Podcast, show 263.
Welcome to We the SE's podcast, the show for sales engineers by sales engineers with your host, Ramzi Majaba.
What's up, SE Nation? My name is Ramzi Majaba and I am your host. I get a lot of people calling me, telling me, hey, I want to be a sales engineer, so I'm looking at a tech sales boot camp or stuff like that. Or I want to be an SDR, but I'm looking at a SE boot camp. And it doesn't make sense because they're two totally different things. I think sales engineering is the best job ever. I would never do an SDR job, not because it's a bad job, it's just because I am not fit for it. I am not a cold caller. Even for the SE hotline, I have a hard time calling people up and telling them about it, even though I think it's a great service for people. Like, people benefit from it. So maybe, and that's the personality thing, and that's my fault because I need to be getting out there more, but I have a hard time with it. So imagine I have to do it for some other company that I may or may not believe in their product. Anyways, that being said, I'm not a good fit. So I'm not an SDR. I will never be an SDR. Never is a harsh word. If I have to, you never know. But I figured I'll get someone in who was an SDR, is currently an account executive, and we'll talk about that because everything I talk about SDR is from what I've heard from other people. Might as well get someone in to talk about it. And today's guest, his name is Erich Finch, engineer, SDR, now an account executive, and he will talk about how he got to where he's at today. What is an SDR? What does they look like? What is an account executive? What's the difference between the two? So let's just jump into the show with Erich. Mr. Finch, how you doing?
Hey, good. How are you?
I am doing well. Well, it's good to have you on the show, Erich. I know who you are. I've seen your YouTube videos, so free plug for your YouTube channel coming later on. But before we get there, do you mind introducing yourself to the audience and what do you do and where you are today?
Yeah, so appreciate you having me on. And yeah, I started making videos on tech sales about a year and a half ago. I'm a former engineer myself, and then now directly in a strictly sales role. So I've kind of had a few roles within sales specifically, but basically gone from SDR to enterprise account manager. And now I actually focus on a new portfolio within the company I'm at. So I work with existing strategic accounts and try and get them to adopt other aspects of our platform that were done through acquisitions in the past. So yeah, lots we could get into. I'm a former athlete as well, but that's maybe the easiest way to talk about my background.
Former athlete in what?
So I was a goalie for the United States in the sport of team handball. So I found that in college, and then actually played when I stopped working as an engineer. I took a year off to actually play overseas and then went into sales. Nice. So yeah.
So I played handball in Lebanon. It was the weirdest sport that I could not. I played basketball and handball.
Yeah.
And in basketball, once you stop dribbling, you're done. The handball, there's like some technique where you jump and you stop dribbling and then you keep dribbling. I don't know. I get confused about it. Maybe we can talk about that, the rules later, and show me how it's done. So here's a random, like, we talk about athletes being good at like sales engineering, and sales is the sports of the business world. Do you feel like any transferable skills from being an actual athlete, not a sales athlete, and actual sales?
Yeah, I think, an interesting parallel for me, the more I've gotten into it, one thing, in sales is obviously talking to the right people as well. And I think if there's one thing that was really pronounced going from like high school sports to then, the last coach that I had was actually a 2-time silver medalist from Sweden. I think you see the difference in people who are performing at a really high level and people who are maybe on their way, right? I think that's a really important thing that comes into sales as well. Knowing who I would say is actually driving significant results, excuse me, and who you want to talk to. And I think also certainly from, I think in athletics, in the type of sport that I played where I'm practicing the same move over and over again to get that technique down. Yeah. There's definitely elements of that in sales where really getting that repeatable cadence, understanding, the finer details and the practice on things that maybe a lot of people gloss over, but that's two of many, many things I could get into for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that popped in my head when you started talking about that is like when we look at athletes, we only watch them when they're playing a game, when it's exciting, things are happening, things are popping. Same with sales. Like when an SE witnesses a salesperson, it's usually in a meeting, they're doing their thing. It's the non-boring stuff. But there's a lot of boring stuff that takes place behind the scenes and repeating that same move over and over. It's not fun. I mean, going to the gym, some people might enjoy it, but squatting every day might not be fun. So there's
Definitely.
a lot of boring stuff that need to take place behind the scenes so that we can do the exciting stuff in
Yeah.
the front of the scenes. I don't know how to say that one.
Yeah, especially I would say, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but as you get to bigger and bigger accounts in sales, that's definitely the case where you're putting in months at a time to maybe get a significant result. And then
Yeah.
everybody sees the email where you're the hero for, closing $1 million deal. And it took 9 months to even get to that point, So absolutely.
It's the overnight success story that is not really overnight.
Yeah.
So you went into engineering. Why did you decide to go into engineering to begin with? And what kind of engineering were you?
Yeah, so I studied basically electrical with a specific focus on telecom. So basically all double E classes, senior year RF. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
and honestly, at the time, I'm glad I did it. It really, both my parents were STEM backgrounds themselves. I was good at math and science, and at the time, I didn't really look beyond engineering that much. So I'm very glad I got the degree. But I think especially like my senior year, and then also when I quickly got into the engineering world, I worked at a large company in like a engineering leadership program they had when you graduated, and I started to get exposure to sales. I started self-educating on entrepreneurship, finance, and things like that, and I realized like I had never even explored these really just because I grew up in a home of engineers, and I think it really started to transition that focus towards business, towards sales, etc.
That's pretty cool. So I studied communications engineering, which is kind of a sister program as electrical.
Yeah.
Most other universities have electrical with a kind of emphasis on telecom in the last year.
Yeah.
It's fairly similar. And yeah, the reason I studied the engineering is because I didn't want to talk to people, which is kind of funny. All right, and so you did engineering and you got closer to sales. What enticed you about sales? What did you see that you thought like, oh, this is good. This could be good for me in the future?
Yeah, I think a few things, but when I was in the engineering role, like I said, I'd been training for sport for quite some time, like intensely 8 times a week, fighting for, playing time, especially transitioning to this sport in college. And to not have an element that I could compete on in engineering was a really difficult one for me, for sure. And then I also think, I mean, let's call it what it is. Like certainly the financial upside, if you perform, was much more enticing. Like I said, I think it's just that environment that I was in college where I had to compete, I had to earn my right to play, things like that. There's some of that in engineering, but certainly from a financial side, having that in front of me in sales is much more enticing. So
Yeah, that's true. The way I became competitive, I used to play basketball. Wasn't as competitive as you. There was no national. I didn't make the national. I wasn't even first div. Let's be honest. Div 3. So, but I found the competition in my work by doing certifications faster than other people, and it became a competition within the team. But the money was not there. As a support engineer and as a network design engineer, which was a senior role, yes, the money is not there, and that's the beauty of sales, where as an engineer, if you work overtime, you're not usually paid for that. It's expected.
yeah.
As a salesperson, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say totally too. I think personally, like I just got to that point where even if I made the same amount of money, I kind of just got tired of like, yeah, that exact, working overtime, not getting paid and all that. So definitely.
As in sales, whether you're a sales engineer, SDR, or an account executive, if you work overtime, generally speaking, and you close a deal, you're gonna get rewarded for that. As engineers, like, no, it doesn't matter what you do. That's your salary. You may get a bonus, you may not. And that's just the way the world is. Okay, so I'm looking at your LinkedIn and I'm trying to get a timeline right. You graduated university, you went into engineering, and then you took a few years off for to play handball. Is that right? Is that what I heard you say earlier?
Yeah, I spent 2 years basically focused on that. One of those years I was actually a telecom contractor. So
Yeah.
oddly enough, I like tested and designed the antenna system for the Atlanta Falcons stadium. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was like 12 to 14-hour days. And
Okay.
yeah, just a mess. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so here's the funny part where you said, "Oh, I tested the antennas at the Atlanta Falcons stadium." I'm like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." It's like, "Oh, that's what broke the camel's back." It's like, "Oh, man, right?"
Yeah.
Like we say things like, "Oh, I did this," but it was the most horrible job I've ever done in my life.
Yeah.
Which is okay. And then you became an SDR, a sales development representative.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not really a move that I see people do from engineering into SDR.
Mhm.
Why did you choose that route?
Yeah, I think at the time, I agree. I guess like to the outside world, it could have been considered like a step down. For me, it was like I was looking at a couple of different options, but I think at the time, with the job market the way it was, it in my mind, I just rationalized that like starting at the entry level would probably be the best path. And so like even in my last engineering job, I was making a little bit more than I did coming in as an SDR. But I think for me, oddly enough, the first company I was at, my manager was actually a former engineer that worked at a very similar company that I had worked at as well.
Yeah.
They also worked for 3 years as an engineer and also took like 6 months off and then transitioned to sales. So it was like an odd, like kind of alignment of I thought I would really learn and get a good foundation from them because they understood like a lot of what I had been through to date. And I think that played out really well. But yeah.
Maybe we can take a second and explain what an SDR or a sales development representative, I have to say it very slow, is. How would you define an SDR?
Yeah. So you're, in almost all cases, you're dealing with leads, and what you're trying to do is reach out to prospects at companies that may use your product and try and set up a meeting to further investigate if it's a fit. So obviously there's a lot more to it, but basically on a daily basis, I would say at any, engineering slash hardcore tech companies, it's not these, most jobs now are, you're not calling like 200 people a day, right? I would say at most good tech companies, you're making anywhere from 40 to 50 calls a day, probably that many or more emails and LinkedIn messages, et cetera, and trying to set up meetings to further explore a fit with the technology.
So question number one, where do you get those leads?
Yeah, so on the inbound side, the company is doing things like webinars. They have white papers. If you've ever tried to download, like this feature in our product, right? So those are constantly coming in and a great source. And then on the outbound side, you can use, there's a lot of sales tools and then also things like LinkedIn to identify like maybe you have a tool that is a great displacement for, I don't know, AWS RDS database, right? You can use LinkedIn as an example to see developers that are using that and then go after them directly, talk about, replacing them, et cetera, et cetera. So,
okay. Like we talk to people in marketing and SDRs where they get one lead from some user, like not really a decision maker. They just want to know something about, they're doing their research and they immediately reach out to that person. And a lot of people take that negatively. Like, yeah, I just downloaded a white paper to do some research. Do you see that often, or is that just in my mind?
no, I see that a fair amount. Yeah. There's always going to be people that are upset that you called. I think we could definitely get into this more, but I think again, it's like, yeah, if you're calling out of the blue and you're clearly just like doing your due diligence and like following up on a lead and you're like, hey, I saw you downloaded this white paper, like, why did you download it? It's like, yeah, like it's clearly going to be a waste of time. So I think, maybe we spend more time talking about what makes a good SDR, but I think, yeah, like you're always going to get some kickback, but also if you come prepared, you're ready to have a meaningful conversation, your stuff. I think it's easier to overcome that than a lot of people think. So.
Okay. And so part of the reason like we kind of start talking to each other is because by the way, what is your website and YouTube channel? You do have a full-time job, but you also have a side hustle, if you want to call it that. What is that? Do you want to plug it right now and we can discuss what we see in terms of SDRs and sales engineering?
Sure. Yeah. So my YouTube channel is Tech Sales with Erich. And then in the description, we actually have a program where we do help people transition to tech sales. But yeah, feel free to check it out. It's in the description of every video and had a lot of success. So,
and I really enjoyed your videos, which is why I reached out to you. I felt there's a lot of value that you're providing. So everybody should check that out. And you mentioned like we could talk about what makes a good SDR. So There's a good segue. What makes a good SDR? Thank you for coming up for the question for me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, you get two sides of the spectrum where you have people who don't know anything about tech and maybe are charismatic. That can help them get conversations. But also, especially, I think, in my niche of selling like really technical products, I've sold databases, DevOps tools, and largely still doing that right now. I think it's really knowing a lot about the product and also being able to drive a meaningful conversation through that knowledge. It would take a long time to break that down, but essentially, in a very highly technical sales role, I'm not sitting there spewing about the benefits of the product, but I'm using my knowledge of the product and how prospects use that tool or competitors to effectively drive a result. And I'm crafting a really good conversation, trying to uncover if there's gaps, or trying to uncover how they want to do things better, things of that nature. So there's no perfect answer, but I think it really starts with product knowledge, not down to the lines of code, but really understanding how that product solves a huge problem, how it's positioned compared to its competitors. And then you can build from that and leverage and start to have really meaningful conversations with all types of stakeholders.
So that definition sounds so similar to sales and sounds very similar to sales engineering. What is the difference in your mind between SDR and sales engineering?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think from like a temperament standpoint, where sales engineering, I think, I'll defer to you, right? But you get the ability to kind of be brought in when conversations are getting more serious. There's already a clear need potentially identified. With sales, I would say just from like a personality standpoint, it definitely takes, especially early on in the SDR role, like you have to be, the first year or two, I think you have to have a really strong, like thick skin to just keep going, detach yourself from the outcome. You're going to get rejected a lot. That's more maybe on the personal level. And then I think just from an SDR and then where you go from their career trajectory, I think there's diminishing returns. I think that product knowledge is really important early on. But yeah, to your point, once you have that in place, it allows you, if leveraged correctly, to start creating meaningful relationships, start coming to high-level prospects with a very strong point of view and trying to start up a conversation, whereas the sales engineer is taking an existing conversation and really trying to map it directly and more specifically to that situation. So I'm sure we could break that down even further, but I hope that helps answer the question. So
let me try to summarize it in my words to see if I understood what you said correctly. So an SDR is kind of the initiator of the conversation, and you kind of have to have enough technical information to entice the prospect to meet, gather more information, and then pass it on to the salesperson. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the salesperson has the purview if they want to bring in an SE or not, but that's beyond that. Is the SDR still involved in the deal at that point, or are they just pass it on and we're done?
Usually they just pass it on, and they're done. So
okay. Okay. And you mentioned earlier that like people used to do 200 calls a day. Now they're only doing 40, and they're kind of doing LinkedIn and email. I'm curious, those 40 calls a day, how long does it take to complete those? Because for me, when you say it's 40 calls a day, that's a week's worth of work.
Yeah.
So
yeah, when you're cold calling, it's maybe an hour and a half. A lot of that too is going to depend on who picks up. But yeah, I think if you actually block your time well, then yeah, you can get through that in roughly an hour and a half. So
40 calls in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming some of them are like don't want to talk to you, or some of them are no answer and call back later.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, I would say out of 40 calls, maybe 2 to 3 people are going to pick up, and of those, maybe 1 or 2 is going to have a conversation. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it's a numbers game, right? And like right now these days, in terms of from a customer's perspective, many people don't want to even answer the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where are you finding more success, email or phone or LinkedIn?
Yeah. It's definitely, admittedly, it's become more challenging. I think part of that is even in the last 4 to 5 years, there's so many sales tools now that allow you to do so much more volume that the end prospects are like catching on to that, and they're so tired of getting called. Yeah, there's no right answer. I think there are still people that are able to have some success with a phone call. I will say, I think the nuance here is, like in my position, I'm working with existing users of our product to help them evaluate other aspects that they're not currently paying for. And I think I have a much easier time reaching out of the blue, because when they hear my company name, they recognize that they're already using it.
Right.
I would say from a cold outreach perspective, it's hard to say, but probably like LinkedIn email is maybe a little bit more responsive than cold calling at this point. But it really, a lot of that too depends. Like if you're selling to DevOps engineers, phone is almost impossible, right? But if you're selling to like maybe a less directly technical persona, you may be able to have a more meaningful conversation about, more strategic initiatives, technical roadmaps, as opposed to like, okay, well, tell me this specific line of code, right? So yeah, always trade-offs.
Would SDR target like DevOps users, or is the target usually someone higher up, or does it
Some of
matter?
both.
Okay.
Yeah. So it really depends. So
Okay. And when I think about SDR, and this is my view of it, and it's a little bit negative, so correct me, please. I would love to learn. But I've talked to several, and this is what I see. Generally, even if they're not in the office, it's like there's someone standing behind them and watching their every move, their every call, their every email. If they need to take a bathroom break, they have to justify it sometimes. So is that reality, or is just my perception of how SDRs are treated?
I think it's largely perception. There's definitely companies like that exist, but I think at most reputable tech companies that it's fairly reasonable work. Like, yeah, you've absolutely got to work really hard. I think over time, when you get beyond SDR, that transitions to more working smart, working more efficiently. But yeah, I think SDRs as a whole, like, don't get me wrong, it's not an easy job, but I think you can absolutely be effective with a solid 8 to 10 hours of work, every day if you're truly focused.
Okay. And when you transition from engineering and sports into SDR, did you know what you're getting yourself into, or was it more of a surprise? How did you handle the first few months of not knowing the product and still having to sell it?
Yeah, so oddly enough, in my first engineering role, I was an applications engineer. So I will say I did get a lot of customer facing exposure to certainly troubleshooting, but also there were times where the sales team would be involved in a conversation that got technical, and they would call me in to that call, right? So in terms of like knowing the day to day, I had a lot of exposure. Yeah, certainly going from maybe more like signal processing, automated testing to like databases, that was definitely a step there. But I think at the time, especially after a year off, I was just so ready to try something new that it really helped me. Like, yeah, it was a steep learning curve, but I think it never really bothered me, or I never felt too overwhelmed, just knowing it was kind of part of the process ramping up, so.
Okay. So by the way, applications engineering in many companies are sales engineers, just with a different title.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that, sometimes it's something different. Like, was it more post-sales work or pre-sales?
Mostly pre-sales, and yeah, similar
Well,
thing.
you were a sales engineer for a bit. You just didn't know it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would get brought in, and yeah. So I believe your direct competitor now, if I'm not mistaken, is where I was. So yeah.
Well, yeah, different. So, like I'm part of a small group within that's not competing with your former company, which shall remain nameless for this point. But you can go on his LinkedIn and figure it out. It's not that difficult.
Yeah.
Scroll all the way down. All right, so you did the SDR. Was your goal, like, did you think that, okay, I'm gonna go in as SDR and then switch later on into some other role, or was it, let me go do an SDR job and like I plan to be here for a while?
No, I definitely wanted to promote to account executive and beyond. And I would add too, for anyone that's watching and thinking about tech sales, like, it is absolutely okay to like want to promote beyond that. People want to see that ambition in the role. And for me, yeah, like I was ready to pay my dues as an SDR, but long term, that's absolutely why I got into sales. Is, the roles, SDR can be a nice job, don't get me wrong, but the roles beyond that certainly get more and more lucrative. So that was, yeah, definitely my goal.
Okay. And so how did you know about all these roles before you even jumped in? Like, you spent a year and a half, were you doing research 24/7? I thought you were playing handball.
Yeah, a combo of both. Like, one, I mentioned I did get exposure to sales at that first company, so I got a little bit of a feel there. And then also some of my colleagues from that company had gone on either within that company to promote up or also to other companies as well. So I stayed in touch with them. And yeah, I think, when I took that year off, the first 6 months, I was largely, hopping around overseas. When I came back and realized I was probably going to be done with sport at the end of the year, that's when I started to network with my buddies. And actually, kind of full circle on that, when I started making videos as well, I realized that there really wasn't a lot providing, on YouTube or otherwise, like giving a really accurate picture of highly technical sales. So anyway, before I get off on that tangent, like, yeah, I leverage my network. And I would honestly say too, as well, to anyone watching, it's like, you'd be amazed at how many salespeople maybe didn't plan on being in sales or transitioned to sales, and they love helping people evaluating the career talk about it. Like, you'd be amazed if you went to any salesperson and were like, hey, I'm considering this career because of X, Y, and Z, was wondering if I could pick your brain for 15 minutes. You'd be hard pressed to find, more than 10 or 20% of people who would reject that message. So yeah.
So I offer the same advice for people who want to get into sales engineering. I find sales engineering is the best community in the world, better than sales. No offense. We can compete about that later on. But yeah, like if you reach out to people, they will say yes to chatting, and similarly with sales in general. If I have a lot of people come to me and say like, hey, I'm gonna do this course that's tech sales, and I want to become an SE, and either they don't know that tech sales is not sales engineering, especially when they say tech sales, they actually mean SDR, or they think it's a good step into sales engineering. What do you think? If people come to you and say, hey, I want to do tech sales so I can get into sales engineering, what is your initial response?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a long game, and obviously it's going to be dependent on your background. Like I've actually had a guest on my channel before that went that SDR route to sales engineering. What that required of them, it took them, I think, a year and a half to 2 years, but they were very upfront with their management going into that role that, hey, I'm an SDR right now. I want to get very good at this. Long term, I want to use this to transition to sales engineering. But I might add that person also had a mechanical engineering degree before becoming a sales engineer. And so, I'm sure, and I'll hand it back to you to get your perspective as well. I think the SDR role can be a stepping stone into a sales engineering role. But if you don't have a technical background at all, you're trying to be an SDR for like a DevOps tool that's highly complex software, and you think that without any other certification, or if you're just an SDR for a year, that you could go to SE, that's not the case. Like, I would absolutely foster those conversations with leadership in your company, but expect that they're going to want you to do a bunch of certifications, maybe try a different role or two throughout before you go full sales engineer, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm curious how that maps to, your thoughts.
Well, my thoughts is I don't think SDR is a stepping stone to sales engineering as any other, like it's the same as any other role, really. Like there are better roles that are stepping stones, like customer success or technical account management. I think it's doable. You've talked to one person. I've talked to many who've become SEs after being SDRs, but they didn't become SEs because they were SDRs. They just happened to be SDRs who became SEs, and they still had to work really hard. My advice usually is like, if you really need the money right now, like if you already have a job and you want to go into sales engineering, just go into sales engineering. If you really need the money, and now I'm throwing this back at you. I think SDR is an easier job to get initially than sales engineering. So now you can work in the sales environment, connect with SEs within the company, try to find a job with, a lot of companies have SDRs that don't have SEs. So find a job with a company that has both and try to learn from them and see what certifications you need to do, who you need to meet, and go that route. What do you think?
Yeah, totally. 100%. Like SDR jobs are absolutely easier to get than SE roles. And
they're not easier jobs though, which I find funny.
I think it's a different temperament too, kind of back to what we talked about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, like, they talk about, I want to be an SDR so I can become an SE. And I'm like, do you want to do 100 calls a day? Like, no. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
that solves your problem right there. You don't need to do that. But according to you, you don't need 100 calls a day. You need maybe 40, and you can do some emails and LinkedIn. And it depends on the company, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you did the SDR thing. You were great at it. And in 3.5 months, you got promoted, according to your LinkedIn. You got promoted to To sales, I'm assuming? The account
Yeah,
executive. Okay.
the account executive role. Yeah.
So how did that conversation go with your management? Because 3.5 months seems like fairly quickly. Yeah.
Yeah.
How did that conversation go? Where did the SDR manager help? Were they pissed?
Yeah.
I'll leave it to you.
Admittedly, like a lot of luck there. One, I would say from the applications engineering job I had, again, I think I came in and it wasn't like I was great right away, but I was able to pick up on technical concepts. Like I remember, for instance, my third day ever on the job, we had a new product that was launching at the company, and all of the SDRs had to give a presentation. And like I finished second on my third ever day in the job, just because I was able to comprehend kind of the tech and the high level value props of the product more than like the non-technical personas. So like that definitely helped. And then as to how I got the promotion, like one, I had done well. Like I hit my number really quick and I was hitting quota each month. But on top of that, we actually, like I mentioned, we launched this new product. They had a shift in how they wanted to bring it to market. So they had a dedicated new team of AEs. And actually, the person who had been there for a year that got promoted into that role left the company. And my manager was like, you know what? Like, here, give it a shot. Like, let's see what happens. Like, we're impressed with what you've done thus far. And like, yeah, fell into it from there. So
here, give it a shot. What would have happened if you didn't like it?
um,
Would you be able to go back?
no, I mean, yeah, I suppose I could have. And actually someone did that now that you mention it. For me, I think my mindset was so different at the time just because I always knew that promoting to account executive was the way I wanted to go. And I mean, admittedly, it was really tough. Like we had a brand new product without getting into the guts. Like if you're selling a cloud product that's only available for Google Cloud users and is not on AWS or Azure,
Yep.
it's like impossible, especially 3 or 4 years ago,
Yeah, where AWS was everything.
Yeah. And so it was definitely tough, but I think I ended up actually finding a lot of success in it. And I think regardless, I would have been fine. I don't know, just my mentality. I was so sick of engineering that I was just ready to just keep going.
Well, why are you? I know you. Okay, you looked at sales and you saw like it's a more lucrative role, but I didn't hear you say until right now that you were so sick of engineering.
Yeah.
Why were you sick of engineering?
Yeah, I think it was a combo of things, and like all respect to the people that I worked for in the past. But I think one, like I said, I went from training 8 times a week to like 3 weeks later being in a 9 to 5 engineering desk job. And like the reality of that, like I was just so naive to it, I think, that it didn't really hit me. And I was like, one, just from a temperament, I should have gone into like technical sales right away. But I think two, it was just like throughout that experience, I mentioned the last time, at the Falcon Stadium, I was being overworked, just working nonstop and training on top of that. And I think even at, my first company as an applications engineer, more power to them, like great, very reputable company. But there was I felt like for me, it was like going from sports where, and even academics where you're graded based on like your merits, your performance, to then there was like a whole political element of working at a super large company that it's just going to happen anywhere you go. It's not, a poor reflection of that company in particular, but there was just so many things that I felt like I had to put my time and attention to that didn't matter to me. And I think sales is the closest thing to like being an entrepreneur within a W-2 type of job. And you do have a lot more flexibility in that regard, so long as you're performing. So, yeah.
I mean, I would say like it's very surprising how much engineering has a lot of Excel spreadsheets involved.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. How would you, now that you've done both jobs, SDR and account executive? I mean, we touched on it briefly. We discussed more about sales engineering, but in your mind, would you differentiate SDR and account executive in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so the account executive is basically, I mean, you may be sourcing some deals yourself, kind of like an SDR, but oftentimes in the higher and higher you go, many times SDRs are bringing deals to you that you then further qualify and drive to close. And so what that typically requires is usually, when you first interact with a customer, an SDR has identified it, or maybe a customer filled out a demo request. You're going to go through like a 30-minute discovery call where you're learning more about their use case, mapping it to your solution. At that point, if it is a fit, then you're probably bringing in a sales engineer at that point for the next call, do a much deeper dive. And then from there, there's so many things we could get into. But again, if the sales engineer identifies a fit, now we're looking at a POV. You've got to drive legal, procurement, make sure they have your SOC 2s, all these different things in place. You've got to network up to the VP of engineering or the CTO who's ultimately going to sign all that stuff. So yeah, that's where it really changes.
Okay. From an account executive perspective, what makes a good SDR for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, yeah, this speaks to a couple of things, like going back to that foundational knowledge, which I think is one piece. If you can use that, and I can tell as an SDR, you've been able to vet out a fair amount of information. Like, it's the difference between an SDR coming to me and saying, hey, this person is interested in automation capabilities, right? That's a real thing for my day job, versus another one that's coming to me and saying, hey, I spoke with so-and-so who mentioned that they're trying to automate these 3 different things. They haven't had any luck, and they've tried these different tools and are looking at this competitor. So they want to talk to you to learn how it fits that use case. Like, if you have that knowledge, you make my life easy. Not only does it help me in like a selfish way, but then, most good AEs are going to go out of their way to go back to the SDR manager and say, man, hey, this person's giving me all the information I need. They're doing a really great job. They're ready for that next step. So yeah.
I mean, I agree with that. Most of the SDRs that I've worked with come to me and say like, hey, this guy's interested in this product. Which part? Oh, it's the product in general. He's interested in it, or she's interested in it. All right. When would they need to buy it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Do they have money for it? No. Right. There's a lot of these mumblings. So I'm like, all right. So you basically did what? You received a lead from a lead magnet on the website, and you immediately forwarded to me. It's like, no, I jumped on a call with them, and then what did you talk about? Just that the fact that they're interested in this product. Like, well, thank you so much. I'll take it from here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've had these interesting conversations. Can someone just go into account executive without being an SDR?
Usually not. There are some exceptions. There's some companies out there. Like I just say this because I have a couple of buddies in my network there, but like there's companies like a MongoDB of the world that will actually take people with non-sales experience, like accounting or whatever, and you can come in and be an account executive, but they have really extensive training. So I would say if you're early in your career, you don't have any engineering experience or maybe a year or two, you're probably looking at that SDR role.
Okay. I had a question in my head right now, and I just completely whiffed on it. What was it? All right, that's good hosting. All right, well, so we're almost at the end of our call, Erich, and I just want to make sure, did I ask you every question that you wanted me to ask? Is there anything that you wanted to discuss that I didn't bring up?
I guess for your viewers, if they had any questions on kind of the differences between the two paths, or if there's anything we didn't highlight there that would be worth going over, that's the only thing that comes to mind.
Okay, well, I don't have access to them right now. So how about this? If you have any questions for Erich, make sure you leave a comment on the YouTube channel, tag him, or jump onto his YouTube channel and ask him these questions. I'm sure he'd be happy to help. So tell me a little bit more about your project. You said you help how do you help SDRs or identify SDRs to get a job? Or yeah, that was the worst plug ever. Let me try this again. Mr. Finch, so you're working on a side project to help SDRs get jobs, or to help people learn what SDR is. Can you talk a little bit more about that and where people can find it?
Yeah, so the project is Tech Sales Ascension. So right now we help anyone break into an SDR role. Typically, I'm working with people that are upcoming college graduates, all the way to, we actually helped someone 2 weeks ago that had worked a couple different careers, most recently actually a technician for autonomous vehicles, transition into an SDR role. So I think, and really just talking about why we do this, because there's definitely a lot of programs out there, and I think do your research. I'm not saying mine is the best, but I noticed out there's a lot of programs that aren't geared towards highly technical sales. So they're teaching like sales best practices, which could apply to cars, logistics, real estate, that doesn't apply to tech sales. And also, I think the really important distinction is, obviously we have some live coaching baked into it, but a lot of the content we make is actually from numerous reps in the industry. So that was a big thing for me. It's not just like Erich Finch's sales methodology. It's like me. We've got a top performing rep from HashiCorp. If you have any familiarity, we've got another rep from MongoDB that's actually recently transitioned to a startup that are all contributing content. And I think that's the really important thing is we gear it in a way that you get multiple perspectives, and also in a way that we emphasize, like, yes, getting knowledge about sales, but really the important thing is if you treat the interview process like a sales process, which we go through, we really put that emphasis on action. And I think a lot of people want to sit there and read a book, watch another video from me, learn that one more concept that's going to make them feel confident. And there's just diminishing returns. Like, we really put an emphasis on getting out there and teach you how to do that.
Yeah. Start doing. That's the first thing I tell people. Start connecting with people. Like, don't. I need my resume to be perfect. Like, no, just start connecting with people. If people start asking you about your resume and you say like, oh, it's not, I don't think it's up to par, ask for their feedback. Don't tell them like, oh, this is my best resume. It's like, no, well, I'm still working on my resume. I would love your feedback about it before we send it to whoever it is that you're going to send. Actually, the question came up right now. How can someone do a self-assessment to see if they could be or would be a good SDR?
Yeah, I think, like, honestly, there's a couple of ways. Like, yeah, I mean, if you've been thinking about sales for like 6+ months, I think that's honestly a good gauge, like in the sense that you should explore it further, whatever that means, whether it's educating, networking with people in your network, looking at formal programs. I would say, at its simplest terms, like if you have the desire to go into sales, all of the energy, the thick skin that comes with that, and really what I don't think is talked about enough, like the desire to learn, come in at zero for a year or two. That's at the simplest level, like all it takes. And obviously it's not that simple. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of things you got to learn, but yeah, it's really not more complicated than that. And I think as you get exposure to what we're talking about now with taking action, to networking, et cetera, it will fill in the gaps and you'll get a lot of opinions on what you need to learn more specifically than just coming in with a lot of drive and eagerness to learn. So.
Well, I had just an idea as you were talking. A very low bar to know if you'd enjoy being an SDR or not is have a goal of connecting with 20 people a day. If you achieve that goal, you're there, especially when you have nothing to sell, because it only gets harder when you have something to sell. If you can't do that, maybe it's not meant to be. Erich, this has been great. It's time to jump into the not so fire round. We might have to do it in 5-round succession. I hope that's okay. These are the same 4 questions I ask almost every guest, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Number 1, what do you love about being an account executive today?
I think driving significant results. Like one of the first deals that I closed, I would say one of the most significant deals I closed in my career was with an e-commerce company like 3 weeks before Black Friday. Their current solution was like already breaking down, not including Black Friday traffic. And this is like the first year of COVID when everything, that e-commerce accelerated, right? Yeah. And so all that to say, super long story short, but like we got a solution in place. We worked around the clock to get them set up. They grew 700% year over year. And like a lot of people's careers were like success or like very positively impacted because of that. And that's, I don't want to get like too meta. Like obviously there's a financial component with that, but it was really cool to see such a drastic result in such a short amount of time. So
nice. Yeah, I like that. All right. If your boss were to ask you today, what is your superpower? What would be your answer?
I think the thing that comes to mind right now is just detachment from the outcome. I think for me, it's just really focusing on like the tactical ins and outs. Not that like I need some tactic to like hack a sales call, but it's like I'm not, I think if anything, I'm consultative. My technical background helps with that. And I'm more just there trying to solve a problem than trying to like hard close someone or be, like a weird, greasy salesperson. So I just tune out the noise, I think, better than maybe a fair amount of people.
I like that. This is the first time I've heard that answer. All right. Question number 3, is there a resource other than your own that you would recommend for people who want to get into either SDR or as an account executive?
Yeah, I would just add some of the people that I like and follow online, because there's a lot of sales influencers popping up. I think Jeremy Donovan, and it's with 3 E's. So it's Jeremy, Jeremey. It's like the only Jeremy I've ever met that's spelled like that. Yeah, he's got a lot of great content. Chris Orlob is another one that has a YouTube and is also fairly active on LinkedIn. And there's a few others in the space, but I would say those are going to give you a good foundation and help you kind of wrap up.
Nice. All right, last question of the not so fire on Erich is there a habit you're working on today to improve either in your personal or professional life?
Yeah, actually, I am a specialty coffee roaster and I also make specialty chocolate. So when COVID started, I got a roaster and yeah, have gone really deep down the specialty coffee rabbit hole. So
Okay, that's a hobby, right?
yeah.
So let me rephrase that maybe a little bit more clearly. I love that answer though. Is there a habit you're working on today to improve in your professional life?
Misheard
Hey,
you
man, I
there.
love the answer. Maybe I should have just quit there and shut up and moved on. But I really want to, I feel like you have a good habit that you can share.
Yeah. I would say on like the day job, for me, it's been a real emphasis around, especially, working with larger and larger and more strategic accounts. The SDR role was great to get your foot in the door, but I'm really putting emphasis on and having to intentionally slow down and focus on higher quality conversations. And not just like going after the VP of engineering, but everything associated with that, which is researching their company before we have a call, researching all the past opportunities and interactions that we've had in our company database, things like that. So really putting an emphasis on higher quality.
Nice. All right, Erich, we're done. If people want to connect with you, where can they do that?
Yeah, my LinkedIn, I can share that with you. Feel free to share that, and also my YouTube channel, Tech Sales with Erich, is a great resource if you're even just considering tech sales. So,
well, my website has been down for the last week, but I got it up and running yesterday, so everything will be on the show notes on the website this time. It hasn't happened for the last few episodes, but I'm back. So all the links that you mentioned will be in the show notes. Show 263. Erich,
awesome.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, this is the end of the show. Thank you, Erich, for coming on. As usual, thank you for being here, for listening, for investing your time with this podcast. If you are finding it useful, please make sure to like it on YouTube, share it, and also on iTunes or Google Play or wherever you listen to this. Leave a rating and review. It doesn't hurt. Actually, it helps. So, what do you guys think? If you were to choose between SDR, account executive, and SE, which one would you think it fits your personality the most? Leave that in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any questions for myself or for Erich, I think by now you know where to find us. But if you don't, the links will be in the show notes now that the website is back up and running. Show 263. So wetheSalesEngineers.com/show 263. I will see you next time. With that, I'm signing off.